Here's my take. Why is the most powerful country on the planet unable to get its way with a much smaller, weaker country that has been ravaged by economic sanctions and military strikes? At one level, the simplest way to understand America's problem in the Iran war is to use game theory. Donald Trump decided to play a game of chicken with Iran. Think of two drivers racing straight at each other. In these situations, if the stakes for one side are existential and for the other much lower, the side with those bigger stakes usually prevails. For the Iranian regime, if they lose, there's a good chance they end up toppled and slaughtered. For Trump, it would be a bad weekend at Mar-a-Lago. It's easy to see why the Iranians would be more willing to lock their steering wheel in that game of chicken. But there's a broader reason why America has found it so difficult to handle Iran, one that is not just about Trump and this latest ill-conceived war. Ever since the Islamic regime took power in Iran, America has been of two minds about it. On the one hand, the U.S. has had certain issues it wanted resolved, from the return of the hostages to nuclear limits. On the other hand, it wants to topple the regime, not just negotiate with it. There is a tension in these two attitudes that has run through American foreign policy for almost half a century. Does Washington want to change certain policies of Iran, or does it want to change Iran? If Washington negotiates with Tehran, inevitably there is give and take. There are concessions on both sides. There is some relaxation of hostilities. Above all, in engaging with it, the United States government is conferring a certain degree of legitimacy on the Islamic Republic, treating it as a serious negotiating partner, accepting that it represents Iran on the world stage. But that acceptance sits uneasily with some American elites who feel that the Islamic Republic is illegitimate, should not exist, and Washington's only policy toward it should be to overthrow it. And yet there are things Washington wants that only Iran can deliver. That is why even Ronald Reagan found himself secretly negotiating with the Iranian mullahs while publicly denouncing them. We can see the tension almost daily in Donald Trump's policy toward Iran. One social media post threatens to destroy Iranian civilization and bring an end to 47 years of evil. Another one that same day speaks of the progress being made in negotiations with Iran. Trump enters negotiations and seems optimistic about a deal with Iran, and in between rounds starts a war with Tehran and urges Iranians to overthrow their government. Less than a week later, he's back to promising that if they agree to his demands, Iran will have a very bright future. America had a similarly contradictory attitude toward the Soviet Union. After the communists took control of Russia in 1917, Washington broke relations with it and even tried in some small ways to overthrow it. It took Franklin Delano Roosevelt about 15 years later to recognize its existence and exchange ambassadors with Moscow. The tension reemerged after World War II. In the 1970s, Henry Kissinger's policy of negotiation with the Soviet Union was pilloried on the right because it was seen as bolstering the standing of an evil empire. Kissinger's response was always that America stood in ideological opposition to the Soviet Union, but that it also had certain national interests, like the control of nuclear weapons, which could not be handled without agreements with Moscow. Kissinger's equivalent in the Iran debate was Barack Obama. Obama's was the one administration to make a choice. It determined that while America might prefer another regime in Iran, it had to deal with this one to tackle the greatest danger to America's national interest, which, as with the Soviet case, involved nuclear weapons. The Iran nuclear deal was an effort to take the one most dangerous element of Iran's foreign policy and neutralize it. And it succeeded at that. But for many on the right, the price was that it, in some sense, legitimized the regime. So Trump pulled the U.S. out of the deal, which then led to the discrediting of then Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and the return of the hardliners in Tehran, who ramped up Iran's enrichment program, which has brought Donald Trump right back to the same dilemma. Does he make a deal or take a stand? At this point, it's clear that Trump wants a deal, But in making it, he might end up giving the Islamic Republic what it has been seeking for 47 years: unqualified acceptance, even from the most hardline elements of the United States. For Tehran, that is a prize worth many concessions. For more on what's next, I'm joined by a top analyst who has studied the Islamic Republic for most of his career. Danny Citrinowicz served as the head of the Iran branch of Israel's military intelligence. He is now a senior researcher at the Tel Aviv-based Institute for National Security Studies. Always great to have you on, Danny. Let me ask you, at this point, you've just heard, I'm sure, that the Iranians have said they have responded to the American proposal. Do you think that response is going to move this forward? I mean, who's the person really who has to move here, Iran or the United States?
Thank you, Fareed, for inviting me. Definitely is the U.S. The ball is in the U.S. court because of the fact there is no much room in the Iranian eyes for compromises. Now, they are demanding lifting of the naval blockade. They want to negotiate first and foremost the condition to end the war, and only then to negotiate on the nuclear issue. And it goes straight to your column, saying that the U.S. administration need to decide whether he wants to topple this regime, and then you have to return back to war, a serious war, lengthy war, or you want to compromise with the regime, but then he has to show compromises in a way that he has to accept some of the Iranian demands. So I think it's all could turn back to the White House, to the president, and what he will decide eventually will tell us whether we are going to escalation or some sort of a compromise and agreement.
Do you think that we are now witnessing the Iranians really flex their muscles on the weapon that they have, which is the Strait of Hormuz? I noticed yesterday they put out an announcement saying countries that are enforcing sanctions against Iran, those ships might not be allowed to get through the Strait of Hormuz, even if there is a deal. So in other words, they are trying to use this new weapon they have to actually reverse the sanctions that have been in place for decades.
Definitely, you're absolutely right. The Iranian wants to utilize Hormuz Straits for two main reasons. One is to get compensation for the attack, so they're going to charge every tanker that crosses the straits. This is one. And second, of course, they want to utilize that in order to create cracks within the sanction regime that U.S. imposed on them. And this is something they're not going to change. Unfortunately, we have to remember one other thing. The situation in Hormuz Straits is very unstable. So even if President Trump will decide not to decide, meaning is not going to compromise or return back to war, eventually friction will lead to escalation. Because I think that from the Iranian standpoint, they won't accept the status quo. And in terms of when they come to the junction between capitalization or escalation, they will always choose escalation. The blockade, even if it will be effective, it won't lead to Iranian surrender.
So let's talk about what the shape of a deal could look like. I want to first ask you, it does seem like the American side, from what we're hearing, has completely dropped the issue of the ballistic missiles that Iran has, the support for Hezbollah and Hamas. Those were the big criticisms of the Obama nuclear deal, that it didn't include those issues. And my understanding is the Trump administration is not even proposing to discuss those either.
I will say that bluntly. There are not going to be any agreement with the Iranians if President Trump will insist on limitation on missiles and on proxy aid by the Iranians. It's not going to happen. For the Iranians, those are the pillars of the regime itself, and it's a basic of their security doctrine, and they're not going to forgo that. So if President Trump wants an agreement, again, any agreement probably be a problematic one, but looking at the other options that he has, maybe that's the best option. But any agreement will be focused on two main things only. One is the control of the straits, and second, the right to Iran to enrich. Everything that is connected to missiles or proxies, the Iranians will want willing to negotiate. Same thing as the JCPOA, and then we'll ask ourselves, what is really the difference between what we're having now and the JCPOA?